ventricles represent the nexus between the systems, a conjunction point of the three biological factories, as Brad calls them. It is the nexus between the circulatory system and nervous system. Not only is this sacred space the nexus between biological systems, but in a very real sense, it is the nexus between biology and consciousness. It seems to be the crossover point where body gives rise to mind. The idea of the nexus is another one of those ideas that the cultural aesthetic expressed and clearly held in high regard. The practice of crossing the arms of the deceased as part of the funerary process was symbolically associated with this crossover between the internal and external worlds. The modern specialized science that tracks this complicated interaction at this nexus point is called neuroendocrinology.
And this connection of the central nervous system to the endocrine system is what is referred to as neuroendocrinology, and it is through neuroendocrinology where the physiological functions of the body are regulated. The anatomy and functionality of the neuroendocrinological physiology of the body is one of the main keys to unlocking and understanding the teaching of this ancient esoteric wisdom tradition.
So you get people that just are so offended by the presumption of anyone who's going to forward science that they throw something at you that's, I hear this quite a bit, not a lot, but I hear it enough that it bothers me, that there's this idea of confirmation bias. That someone might say, I'm looking at clouds and I see an Indian and I see a scorpion and I see a bicycle. And there is definitely something to confirmation bias. I mean, anyone can look in the clouds and everyone's seen a fluffy bunny rabbit in the sky. A lot of people have seen Jesus in a piece of toast or a tortilla or something, right? There is definitely such a thing as confirmation bias. But there is also this long-standing tradition in art, and it's covered by the science of, it's escaping my mind right now. I'll think of this word, semiotics, the science of semiotics. There's the signifier and the signified. So graphic designers, especially like way before I was in television, I had to do a lot of interface design and computer interface design and any kind of graphic design, any kind of sign making. You're engaged in the science of semiotics that we know just instinctually when we see an 8-sided red octagon that has a meaning, and it doesn't have anything to do with the intrinsic nature of octagons or the color red. So that's a kind of clumsy example of semiotics. But when you are at a bar and you have to pee, and you go and there's 2 doors there, and one has an icon of a man that looks nothing like a man. No man's head is fully detached from his body. No women wear that triangular dress that I've ever seen.
Right.
And yet there's this long-standing tradition that you can say, oh, that man could be anything. That could be a hot dog and a piece of, whatever. It can be anything.
Right.
I see, whatever. I see a whatever. But in the context of this form of visual communication, we can take this simplistic form, and through the art of semiotics, we know that that's the signifier. And what it signifies is, if you're a dude, go in this door to go to the bathroom. And that there's this snap of confirmation that happens, like when you solve a puzzle or when you get a joke or when music really works or it doesn't. And so I want to address this idea that what is the metric, in your opinion, that distinguishes between confirmation bias and just plain confirmation? That I know with these alignments, when you say this looks like a brainstem, it's not just, hey, this kind of reminds me of a brainstem. You go into correlations where you'll show 15, 20, like one correlation. You can call it coincidence. 2 correlations, oh, it's an Indian and the Indian has a hat. But when you get into 5 and 10 and 20 correlations, and if it's specifically in a context, like, the sperm cell in Luxor, there's a sperm cell there, and it's called the water of life. It's coming out of the penis of the pharaoh, specifically in the context telling the story of the birth of the king. And so a person with a really pedantic traditional mindset would automatically say, well, that can't be a sperm cell because they didn't know what sperm cells look like, and therefore that can't be a sperm cell, which is terrible logic and it's bad science, but we hear that a lot. how, maybe I've already trampled over this too much, but talk about how you know the difference between confirmation bias and an actual confirmation of semiotic correlation between an image and what it is intended to represent.
Yeah, well, and it's something to definitely consider, because there's a lot of times where people will say that, where if you're looking for something, and you can put it in there, like you said, you look at images of clouds, and maybe all of a sudden, every time I look at clouds, I'm seeing, oh, that's brain anatomy. Or whatever you're hyper focused on is going to be the thing that you're going to try and interject into, everything you're looking at. And I have thought about that, and I think some of it that I realized is that there are multiple instances. If it was just the Venus of Willendorf, then you'd only have one that to stand on. But there's multiple ones of them. And there's other Venus figurines that, to me, just look like female bodies. I can't say that they're necessarily brainstem or look like brain anatomy. The ones that we do show in the series, I feel like look like brain stems to me.
You do a remarkable job. You do a really remarkable job, especially with the case of the Ishtar statue, where you acknowledge that, yes, bulbous hips have always been around, and maybe bulbous hips are synonymous with fertility, but you don't often see these big, crazy, bulbous shoulders that happen to correspond exactly with the thalamus and so you've done a really good job.
You don't see that in human beings, though.
Yeah, you never see that.
Even if you see an obese person, they don't have these they don't have elephantitis of the shoulders. That's not a feature. But the other thing I was going to say is, we've only really presented in this the first series the visual confirmations. You can then get past confirmation bias when you get into the mythology and the stories behind Inanna and the stories behind Ishtar and the stories behind Artemis and the mythology and the symbolism. When you get into the symbolism of those characters that are these statues are made of, they also tie into aspects of physiology. With Artemis and Sybil and Diana and that stuff, often they're considered, the queens of heaven, the ladies of heaven. They're considered, and as we've talked about, this idea of heaven being the higher place up, and the heavenly vault is the head.
Right.
So these ideas of the queens of heaven ties them to the head. They're often associated with the moon. The moon is associated with the mind. You can start adding on to not only just are these just visually similar. So that idea of just because it looks like that doesn't mean it is that. You can keep building the support for that case once you start going into the symbology and the mythology behind it. And have you ever heard of this guy named Tony Nader, Nader? He was a neuroscientist, and he wrote a book about how, I think this is in the 90s, about how the physiology of the human body is represented in the Vedic text of the Ramayana. And he's the first person to show, as far as I've seen, that, you ever seen the images where they show Ganesh, the elephant god, next to the brain? And he was the person who made that correlation. That's another one of those things that gets thrown up online all the time and nobody cites it, in the same way that everybody rips off that image of his and showing the Eye of Horus and the brain, and nobody cites him. Tony Nader, I think, was the first person to show that image of Ganesh. But he's versed in Vedic mythology, and he's a neuroscientist who I think taught it at MIT and Harvard. I don't know enough about his whole background. But he's able to, since he understood Vedic mythology, he was able to show how that Vedic mythology and the characters in the Ramayana correlate to human physiology and correlate to human parts to parts of the brain, and how characters are representing this part of the brain and this, that, and the other thing. So it's stuff like that where you go, it's no longer just these are similar shapes. It's the stories and the symbols and the motifs and these other things that are adding to it. So you can, to a degree, get rid of confirmation bias. I could be wrong about any of the things that we've presented, but I feel like I can present a solid case on multiple fronts, other than just this looks like that.
Yeah.
And even the Michelangelo painting on the Sistine Chapel, it clearly looks like a brain. But there's also there's a motif and there's a theme going on there, which is God is reaching out and making contact with man, and Sophia is coming out of the center of the brain. So it's not just a story of it's not just Michelangelo going, hey, look, that's what the human brain looks like. He's telling you this, the power that the human brain has to make these bigger connections, and to make to just it's not just like we've said, it's not just biology for the sake of biology. It's not just someone going, hey, I cracked open a skull and this is what I found inside of it, you know. And so I think and going back to what you're saying before too about like this nexus point, I think that's something that's important to talk about. Is in almost every esoteric religion is this point of the union of duality, the resolution of duality. And I feel like in too much of this community where people are interested in consciousness and that sort of thing, they disregard the body. And they sort of, and I've done it in the past too, where you talk about the meat suit, that I'm more than just this body. I'm this much bigger. When my body dies, I'm going to keep going on and that stuff. But again, I think there's that you have to resolve mind and body. You can't have the opposing polarity of the two and say I'm this, but I'm not this. You're both. I mean, you know, talk about the little Brad running around in here. I'm in here somewhere, somehow. This physical body, and you know, people get so angry at the materialists and the scientists who are so focused on material, but we are material, you know, and we do have this, and so I think you need to resolve the duality of mind and body and put them into one, and which we are, you know, and I don't necessarily know where consciousness, how it operates. None of us really seem to know where does it come from, how does it operate. But it clearly seems to be from all of our ancestors in this artwork that they're talking about consciousness in relationship to the brain. Does that mean the brain is generating consciousness? Who knows? But it's definitely showing that this is an important look here. Like, you know, go to here and look, and this is where this is important. So.
Did you get that Stanford? There was a really remarkable, I'm surprised that people didn't make a bigger deal about it, that there was an announcement from Stanford University that somebody in cognitive sciences, somehow with PET or squid imaging or neural network analysis or something, they made a statement that they're fairly confident now about the very early phases of understanding where consciousness arises from. And it was, as you predicted, and as the art predicted, the central brain stem. So we've talked a lot, and I frequently evangelize about how the left and right hemisphere science has been rectified, and it's come roaring back through the agency of Ian McGilchrist and his amazing book, Master and His Emissary. I've been talking to Tony Wright quite a bit lately, just bottomlessly interesting character. And he's talked to Ian. He's had better experience with McGilchrist returning his calls and stuff than we have. But the point of this was, it fell out of fashion for a while in the 70s that, you know, the left brain does this and the right brain does this. And then science kind of turned its back on that idea. But he rectified the model and kind of brought it back to its prestige, and that it is really legitimate that you have these eternally paired adversaries in your left and right hemisphere, checks and balances and whatnot. And that it really makes a kind of satisfying sense that the you that's outside of you, because there's something that's looking at your thoughts. There's something generating thoughts, and you have your Republicans and Democrats in your head fighting across the aisle, but there's a third person that's sitting back and observing that. And so, you know, it's a big thing in Gurdjieffianism that self-observation and observe the observer that's observing yourself. And it suggests this third thing. Gary Osborne is all about the third force of consciousness, too, that you have this very definitive left hemisphere consciousness and right hemisphere. The reason I keep wanting to bring up right brain, by the way, and I should have brought this up when we were talking about confirmation bias, there's something about artists, graphic designers, visual artists, all kinds of visual, aesthetic-based people. We've spent our lives working this bicep of the right hemisphere, the visual spatial relationship thing, and the muscle for creativity, for creating something out of nothing. But pattern recognition in artists and in musicians, oddly enough, because they rely so heavily on the right brain, for right hemisphere dominant people, or for people who have a non-atrophied right brain, they look at these presentations we're making and it's obvious to them. But for people who have a little small reason for their right hemisphere, a little atrophied right brain, which society hugely rewards. Our society is all about the left brain. I just started working out again, and I can't think in the gym because they force me to listen to this ridiculous pop music. And if you go out to eat lunch, they pump music at you, and everything in society is all about keeping you from ever being introspective. I think that's why the neo-shamanistic culture is so important, because it's so discouraged to use your right hemisphere. And as we've talked about, if you work on a furniture assembly line, or if you're in a car manufacturing plant, and you're like, today I'm going to do something different. I'm going to go whimsical today with the way I put this chair together or the way I put this car together. That's not cool for mass production. And there's lots of reasons why the industrialized society discourages right brain activity. And even people have this really nasty bias about people that are right-brained are unreliable and they don't show up on time and they're just flakes, never minding that the reason you were able to get into a car is because of a right-brain guy, or the reason you're able to listen to your radio is because of right-brained people. But anyway, I was really empowered and very glad to find this wave of right-brained people who instantly got the discoveries that we're presenting. And it tends to be people who are just noticeably, painfully left-brained that say, oh, that's not it. That's just confirmation bias.
I think the other thing about that, too, is this idea. I think the left brain wants the pattern to be exact. And I think the right, like a lot of these, like the Venus stat, all of this stuff it's similar composition. It's not exact, but it's close. Like, I mean, like the whoever it's supposed to be, the Karnak Ramses as Osiris underneath the ram's head. I mean, the shapes are similar. It's the composition that's similar. And so from an artist, I can look at another. I've had this happen to me where I'll make a poster for a band, and another artist makes a poster, and we have similar compositions. It's not the same thing, but our layout is very similar. And so it's that ability to look at patterns and go, oh, those are similar. This is similar here. This is similar here. That's similar here. And I think the left hemisphere wants it to be totally congruent, like some sort of mathematical proof where triangle ABC is congruent to triangle XYZ, because you can prove it with all of this stuff. So I think some of that is that left hemisphere is that it says, well, that doesn't look like that, or I don't see they're not the same.
It's a
Clearly
really
they're
good
different.
point. The need for literalness. The left brain loves the familiar and it loves literalness. The right brain is the domain of humor and music and metaphor. That's a really important word in what we're doing. The thing that you're talking about in particular, the horns of Amun, Khnum is the potter's wheel, and he's the one with those really spirally long horns. He's the one that takes the potter's clay and puts the fire in it, which is a metaphor for our body with the fire of consciousness inside. And so when one of the next scripts we're working on is called The Perfect Black. It's based on one of Aaron's chapters in his awesome book, Alchemical
By the
Traditions.
way, I grabbed that book when you emailed me about that. There's only a couple of, because it's just a couple of chapters from different authors. Yeah. And I had only read a couple of them by Divinis. I can never pronounce
August Divinis. Yeah, he's amazing.
Ooh, amazing. Everything I read of his stuff, I'm just blown away. But I read Aaron's The Perfect Black chapter.
Isn't that something?
It's marked up to shit. I've underlined everything. There's so much in there that is just brilliant.
Well, that's our next script.
I'm so glad you mentioned it to me.
Yeah, I'm glad you're resonating with that. That's literally the next script we're going to do. So what that is all about is Amun, the hidden one, who resides in the perfect black. And you know where the perfect black is. And so the point of this is that this is artwork that was clearly created by right-brain people for right-brain people. So if you've ever, remember I don't know how long ago this was, or if it's still a thing, but remember those posters with all the speckles, and if you did the right thing with your eyes, you'd eventually see this 3D shape? Yeah. I know so many people that think that's an elaborate conspiracy and that everyone's pranking them because they just can't make it work, and they just will not believe that there's really a shape there, and they really, I know a couple people who think it's an elaborate prank on them, that there's no such thing, because they can't do it, they can't make it work. Genetically, some people can roll their tongue and some people can. There's an actual gene that allows you to do it, and some people can't do it. Some people are so left hemisphere dominant that they cannot understand metaphor, they have a terrible sense of humor, they're awful at music, and they get mad at the suggestion that a ram and these horns and Amun the Hidden One and all the context that you were talking about all build to create this visual and ideological metaphor, and that the gods themselves are metaphors for aspects of the psyche.